He laughed at her in front of the entire surgical team. But when he suddenly passed out mid-operation, the new girl everyone ignored became the one person who could save him. The operating room shimmered under the glare of sterile overhead lights. It was a bright afternoon, and outside the windows of St. Mark's Surgical Center, the sky stretched cloudless and blue. Inside, the air was cool and still, held taut, with anticipation as the surgical team prepped for the afternoon procedure. Dr. Andrew Whitman stood near the head of the table, donning his gloves with exaggerated flair, grinning beneath his surgical mask. His reputation had preceded him, a brilliant surgeon with nearly 2 decades of spotless procedures behind him. But the confidence he carried, razor-sharp and shiny, often bordered on arrogance. "I hope you all had your caffeine," he quipped, glancing around at the nurses and techs. "Wouldn't want anyone dozing off while I save yet another life." Laughter bubbled from a few staff members, polite, if slightly strained. No one wanted to be on Whitman's bad side. Nurse Ayanna Bell stood to one side of the operating table, carefully arranging the surgical tools in perfect alignment. She moved with the quiet precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. It was only her 3rd week at this hospital, but she had spent years in high-pressure ERs and trauma centers. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. She scanned the medication tray, then paused, her brows knitting ever so slightly. "Excuse me, Dr. Whitman," she said softly, lifting a small vial of clear liquid. "This one is labeled midazolam, but the concentration looks off. It says 5 milligrams per milliliter, but the label's slightly smudged. Would you like me to double-check it with the pharmacy?" Whitman glanced up from where he was adjusting the monitor. He narrowed his eyes, then let out a sharp laugh. "Oh boy," he said loudly enough to turn a few heads. "You're the new girl, right?" Ayanna nodded once. Calm, respectful. "Let me give you a tip," he said, gesturing with one gloved hand like a magician revealing a trick. "Let the grown-ups handle the science, all right? I've done this dance longer than you've probably been out of nursing school." There was a moment of silence, thin and cutting. Dr. Miriam Cho, standing by the anesthesia cart, looked up briefly but said nothing. Her eyes darted to Ayanna, then away. A few others chuckled, awkward, unsure. The sound didn't quite fill the room. Ayanna didn't flinch. She simply nodded, set the vial back down with care, and returned to lining up the clamps and forceps. Inside, her stomach tightened like a knot, but her face remained unreadable. She had long since learned how to absorb condescension without letting it echo outward. To be a black woman in medicine was often to walk a narrow bridge, balancing between competence and invisibility, between strength and restraint. She didn't respond. She didn't need to, but she did make a silent note of the label, her instincts whispering that she had been right to question it. Whitman turned his attention back to the patient, Mr. Davis, lying unconscious on the table, his chest rising and falling beneath the sheet in slow, steady breaths. The monitors beeped a steady rhythm, a metronome counting down toward the first incision. "Well," Whitman announced, clapping his hands. "Let's get this show on the road. Try not to drop. Anything, folks?" The team moved into position. Dr. Cho began administering the anesthesia. The room, once alive with chatter, now fell into the solemn rhythm of preparation. Ayanna stepped back slightly, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze lingering for a second longer on the vial. Then she lifted her chin, inhaled, and turned toward her station. Banter, she told herself, just banter. But the sting lingered like an invisible bruise, one no one else seemed to notice or care to acknowledge. Dr. Whitman hadn't just dismissed her words. He had dismissed her. Her experience, her intuition, her authority, all of it brushed aside in a single moment meant to entertain the room and protect his own inflated ego. But Ayanna Bell had seen men like him before. And if there was one thing she knew, it was how to wait and how to watch. Because sooner or later, the truth always found a way to surface, and when it did, It rarely cared for pride, position, or the illusion of control. The soft hiss of the ventilator filled the operating room, a mechanical whisper echoing in time with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Mr. Davis lay motionless on the table, fully sedated, chest exposed beneath the crisp blue surgical drapes. A sterile silence had settled over the room, calm, precise, almost sacred. Dr. Andrew Whitman leaned forward, scalpel in hand, making the first incision along the patient's lower abdomen. His movements were deliberate and confident, almost rehearsed. Years of experience had turned his hands into instruments of certainty. Ayanna Bell stood at her post, hands folded calmly over her gown, her eyes flicking between the instruments, the vitals, and the surgeon's posture. Every movement was a language of its own, and she had long since learned how to read that silent vocabulary. Dr. Cho monitored the anesthesia machine, her brow faintly furrowed as she adjusted the settings. "Vitals stable," she murmured. "Patient's oxygen is good." Whitman nodded without looking up. "Excellent, let's get this gallbladder out before dinner." There was a pause, followed by a few muted chuckles, but the air wasn't light. Something barely perceptible felt off. Ayanna watched as Dr. Whitman's hand, gloved in powder blue latex, held the retractor with a bit more pressure than necessary. The tips of his fingers were unusually tense. When he reached for the suction, there was the faintest delay, a micro-hesitation quickly corrected. Then she saw it. A tremor. Just a flicker in his right hand. Not dramatic, nothing a layperson would even notice. But to Ayanna it stood out like a warning light, the kind of tremble that didn't belong in the OR. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Dr. Whitman, are you all right?" The question hung in the air. A gentle offer. A bridge. He didn't look at her. "I'm fine," he said, a little too quickly. His voice held a brittle edge now. "Just focus on the tray, Nurse Bell." Ayanna stepped back, letting the response fall without reaction. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes remained sharp. He's sweating. Not just the usual flush from the hot lights. Beads were forming along his hairline, dripping down past the elastic of his mask. His breathing wasn't labored exactly, but there was a tightness in his shoulders, a stiffness that hadn't been there minutes ago. Ayanna's mind turned back, briefly, precisely, to earlier that day. During pre-op, when she had entered the physician's locker room by mistake, she'd seen Whitman's coat tossed carelessly over the bench. From the pocket, a small orange pill bottle had peeked out, label half obscured. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Surgeons used caffeine, pills sometimes. Some took anti-anxiety meds before high-pressure procedures. It wasn't illegal. But now, standing here, those memories stitched themselves together with the way his hand had trembled. He's hiding something. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. Whitman continued the dissection, but his movements were growing less fluid, more effortful. He adjusted his grip on the scalpel twice. When he reached for the clamps, his hand jerked ever so slightly, then steadied. He blinked twice, slowly as though trying to refocus. Dr. Cho glanced over, sensing the shift. "Andrew?" she asked gently. "Need a break?" I said, "I'm fine," he snapped, sharper than before. "Can we not act like this is my first time holding a blade?" Silence again. Heavy. Ayanna exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Cho. Both women recognized something they couldn't yet name, but they saw it. Whitman pressed on, sweat now running along the side of his face, disappearing into the collar of his scrubs. The mask clung to his mouth with every breath. Ayanna reached out to adjust the suction settings, her hands working with automatic grace, but her mind remained fixed on the tremor, the sweat, the defensiveness. She had seen seasoned surgeons push themselves past the breaking point before. The stubborn ones, the proud ones, the ones who thought admitting weakness was worse than making a mistake. Pride in a place like this could cost lives. Her gaze returned to the patient. Mr. Davis, unaware of the tension building around him, lay in perfect stillness, trusting, vulnerable. Ayana's throat tightened. The irony wasn't lost on her. A surgeon who'd mocked her for double-checking a label, now clearly struggling to control his own body. And yet even now no one dared to confront him directly, because he was Dr. Whitman, the legend, the untouchable. But something was unraveling. Something, small, quiet, but real, and Ayana Bell, silent, steady, alert, was the only one who had truly noticed. For now, she would wait. But not much longer. The air in the operating room had become unnaturally dense, thick with tension no one dared name. Machines beeped steadily. The scent of antiseptic and cauterized flesh lingered under the hum of fluorescent lights. Dr. Andrew Whitman leaned in, closer over Mr. Davis's open abdomen, the scalpel glinting in his hand. The gallbladder had just been exposed, the procedure entering its most delicate phase. One wrong move could cause internal bleeding. Timing, precision, clarity, everything mattered. But something wasn't right. Whitman's breath came in uneven, huffs now, barely audible through his mask. A sheen of sweat covered his brow, soaking the elastic strap and trailing down the bridge of his nose. Ayana stood just behind him, instinct coiled tight in her chest. She watched his shoulders rise and fall in quick, shallow jolts. Her pulse ticked upward. "Retractor," Whitman murmured, reaching out with his left hand. But instead of the usual fluid motion, his hand froze mid-air, trembled, then dropped slightly, like it had forgotten what it was reaching for. Ayana stepped, in offering the tool without hesitation, her expression neutral but her heartbeat thudding. He took it, but not quite. His fingers closed around the metal, then slipped. The retractor clattered onto the floor, the sound unnaturally loud. Everyone froze. Dr. Cho glanced up from the anesthesia monitors. "Andrew?" Whitman didn't respond. He blinked slowly, then looked around as if trying to orient himself. His face was pale, too pale. His lips, dry and parted, moved slightly. The suction," he mumbled. But the words were slurred, thick, as if moving through molasses. Then he stopped moving. Altogether, Ayana's eyes widened. "Dr. Whitman?" He swayed, clutched his chest, and dropped. The scalpel slipped from his hand as his body crumpled to the floor beside the operating table, hitting the ground with a sickening, heavy thud. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted. Code blue. "Get a crash cart in here!" Dr. Cho shouted, scrambling from her position. Alarms began to blare. One of the residents froze, another dropped a clamp. Chaos fractured the calm in an instant. Ayana didn't flinch. She moved. "Dr. Cho, keep Mr. Davis stable," she ordered, her voice loud and clear, slicing through the panic like a scalpel. Ayana was already on her knees beside Dr. Whitman. She yanked off his mask and placed 2 fingers against his neck. "He's got a pulse. Faint. Rapid." His eyes fluttered, disoriented, glazed. His chest rose in short, labored gasps. Without hesitating, she tilted his head back and began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sweat ran down her own face now, but her focus never wavered. Staff scrambled around them. Someone brought the crash cart. Someone else slipped trying to grab suction tubing. "Push Epi if his rhythm drops," she snapped to the intern standing uselessly by the door. Whitman's skin was damp and clammy, color draining from his face. His hand twitched once, then went limp. Ayana checked his pulse again. Still thready. Charging pads, now. A tech slid the defibrillator beside her. Ayana placed the pads on Whitman's chest, still counting aloud. "Clear." The machine beeped, and his body jolted slightly under the jolt of electricity. His eyes flickered. She leaned close, speaking low, almost into his ear. "Come on, doctor." "Not like this," Dr. Cho called from across the table, hands still managing Mr. Davis's vitals. "Patient stable, barely. BP's holding, I've got him." Ayana nodded, already pressing into another round of compressions. Inside her, something surged, a memory of being doubted, overlooked, dismissed. She had been just the new nurse 15 minutes ago, the one told to stay quiet. Stay in her lane. Now she was trying to keep the lead surgeon alive while stabilizing a patient whose abdomen was still open on the table. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath remained even. Whitman's body jolted again, his lips parted, a ragged inhale, then another. He coughed, wet, gasping. Ayanna eased back slightly, relief crashing over her like a wave, but she didn't let it take her. Not yet. Whitman blinked up at her, confused, dazed. What happened? He rasped. You collapsed, she said calmly. Right in the middle of the operation. His gaze flicked sideways where the patient still lay open and unconscious, where Ayanna had taken command the second he went down. A flicker of realization crossed his face. And then, shame. Ayanna stood slowly, wiping her gloved hands on her gown. Her heart was still pounding, but she looked composed. The room was beginning to stabilize, vitals monitored, backup surgeon en route, order. Restored by the one they'd underestimated, by the one who'd been told to stay silent. And yet, when everything fell apart, it was her voice that carried, her hands that saved. The sound of wheeled gurneys echoed down the hallway as the surgical team rushed Dr. Whitman out of the operating room and toward the emergency bay. His color was still pale, lips tinged with blue, though his breathing had stabilized. A second team would take over now, doctors and nurses working in tandem to keep their fallen colleague alive. In the OR, the tension had not lifted. It had only changed shape. Ayanna Bell exhaled slowly and stepped back toward the operating table. Mr. Davis still lay open, his body vulnerable under the sterile lights. His vitals remained steady thanks to Dr. Cho's unshakable focus. Ayanna, Dr. Cho said, turning to her, can you assist me in closing? There was no hesitation. Yes, doctor. The room fell back into rhythm, not as smooth as before, but functional. Two residents stood off to the side, eyes still wide with disbelief. They had just witnessed a legend fall, and now, the nurse who had been mocked moments earlier was guiding them to the finish line. Ayanna moved with quiet authority, handing sutures, double-checking every instrument with precision. She didn't allow the adrenaline in her system to cloud her focus. Her gloves moved calmly over clamps, gauze, forceps. Her eyes never left the field. In that moment, no one questioned her, not her decisions, not her presence, not her skill. When Mr. Davis was finally stabilized, sutured, and wheeled into post-op, Ayanna stripped off her gloves and gown, then washed her hands under the hot, sterile water. The room had mostly cleared. The scent of iodine and sweat still clung to her skin. Dr. Cho joined her at the sink, her expression soft but contemplative. You kept 2 people alive today. Ayanna didn't smile. She just nodded, the weight of it settling in. That evening, a review was immediately called. The surgical board, hospital admin, and risk managers gathered in the small conference room adjacent to the ICU. It was routine when a surgeon collapsed during a procedure, but the atmosphere was charged, brittle. Ayanna sat quietly in the back. Still in scrubs, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't expected to speak. Just observe. Dr. Cho presented the timeline. Vitals remained stable throughout. The complication occurred with Dr. Whitman's condition, not the patient's. Nurse Bell initiated CPR, stabilized the patient, and assisted in the completion of the operation under supervision. Was there any prior indication that Dr. Whitman was unwell? A board member asked. A silence passed. Ayanna raised her hand slightly, then stood. All eyes turned to her. She spoke evenly. I noticed several signs during the procedure. First, a slight tremor in his dominant hand before the incision. Then sweating that didn't align with standard exertion. I asked if he was okay. He brushed it off. Dr. Cho nodded in agreement. I also saw what appeared to be a prescription bottle. Earlier in his coat pocket, Ayanna continued. Orange vial, white cap. I couldn't see the label clearly. I didn't think much of it at the time. The room rustled with energy. "Are you suggesting he may have been under the influence of medication?" someone asked. Ayanna didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting it's worth investigating. The tremor and disorientation didn't look like simple fatigue. And earlier that morning I had raised a concern about a mislabeled dosage on a med vial, possibly a stimulant. It was dismissed." A murmur of recognition passed among a few physicians. Dr. Cho leaned forward. If he was taking stimulants, and that vial had been improperly labeled or administered at the wrong time, it could have interacted dangerously. By morning, the preliminary toxicology results confirmed what Ayanna had suspected. Dr. Whitman had been using a combination of prescription amphetamines and a beta blocker, one to stay awake, the other to keep his heart rate manageable. It was a dangerous balancing act. The interaction had likely triggered the episode in the OR. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been pushing himself through consecutive 16-hour shifts, held aloft by pills and pride, and no one had noticed, except the nurse. He'd mocked. It hit everyone hard, not just the collapse, but what it revealed. That even brilliance can hide deep recklessness. That experience is not a shield from failure, and that respect must never be reserved for rank alone. Ayanna walked out of the review room into the quiet corridor. The hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead. For a moment she leaned against the wall, letting herself feel it. The fatigue, the weight, the unshed frustration. Footsteps approached. It was Dr. Cho. "He's going to recover," she said quietly. "They're keeping him overnight, and administration will be following up with disciplinary action." Ayanna nodded. "They're also reviewing your full credentials. A few of the board members didn't realize your trauma rotation at Johns Hopkins." Dr. Cho's voice held the smallest trace of a smile. "I'm not here to impress anyone," Ayanna said, her voice calm. "I'm here to do the job." Dr. Cho tilted her head. "You did more than that today." For the first time all day, Ayanna allowed herself a small smile. Because today, the quiet voice in the room, the one dismissed, ignored, underestimated, had been the only one who truly saw what was coming, and had acted before it was too late. The hospital corridor was unusually quiet that morning, the hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the faint echo of rolling carts and murmured voices. Sunlight filtered through slatted blinds in the ICU wing, casting narrow stripes across the polished floors. Outside, the sky was washed in a pale blue, indifferent and calm. Room 314 was at the end of the hallway. Inside, Dr. Andrew Whitman lay in the recovery bed, a light blanket pulled over him. Monitors beeped steadily beside him. His face was gaunt, pale beneath the stubble growing in along his jawline, and his eyes, once sharp with certainty, were softer now, heavier, tired in a way he had never allowed himself to be. He stared at the ceiling for a long time before speaking to the nurse on duty. "Can you call Nurse Bell for me?" The nurse blinked. "Ayanna Bell?" He nodded. "Yes, please." It took nearly half an hour before Ayanna appeared in the doorway. Her scrubs were crisp, her hair pulled back, her eyes unreadable. She didn't rush inside. She simply stood, one hand on the doorframe. "You asked for me?" she said. Dr. Whitman turned his head toward her. His lips parted, but for a long time no sound followed. He looked smaller somehow. His authority peeled away like old paint. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, voice hoarse. Ayanna didn't move. "You saved my life, and the patient's, and you did it without hesitation. He trailed off. "I saw the incident report, and the toxicology. I suppose you noticed more than any of us." Ayanna's eyes didn't waver. "I noticed what I was trained to notice." Whitman's mouth twitched. Maybe it was meant to be a smile, but it faltered. "You tried to tell me earlier about the medication, about me. I didn't listen." "You didn't," she said simply. He nodded. The silence stretched between them. But it wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things, of pride deflated, of realizations blooming too late to take back words. "I'm not good at apologies," he said finally. "I know." She stepped inside and stood at the edge of his bed. "But you can be better, that's the point." Whitman looked at her then, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no arrogance in his gaze. No smugness. Only the weight of someone who had looked over the edge of something and come back changed. "I'm trying," he said. Ayanna gave a small nod. "Good." Then, without waiting for more, she turned and left. In the days that followed, the shift was quiet, subtle but steady. In the staff lounge, conversation slowed when Ayanna entered, but not with discomfort, with recognition. Physicians, who had previously overlooked her, began to meet her eyes, ask for her opinion. Residents mirrored her methods. When she offered suggestions, no one rolled their eyes or joked about the new nurse speaking up. Dr. Cho greeted her with a quiet fist bump one morning. "You've set a bar," she said. Ayanna chuckled softly. "I just did my job." "No," Dr. Cho said, shaking her head. "You elevated it." Later that week, a new sign appeared just outside OR2. It was simple, printed in clean black letters. On a brushed steel plaque, no name, no logo, just 4 words: "Listen, always, everyone matters." People stopped to look at it on their way in. They didn't need to ask who it was for. One afternoon, as Ayanna was charting in a corner of the nurses' station, she noticed Mr. Davis's name on a discharge list. She blinked, remembering how close he'd come to dying. How the scalpel had hovered in Dr. Whitman's trembling hand. How everything had nearly unraveled in seconds. She watched as Mr. Davis was wheeled past her by his daughter, a bright-eyed girl in her early 20s. He was alert now, smiling weakly. Their eyes met. She gave a small nod. He didn't know what had happened. He might never, but Ayanna did. And that was enough. As the shift change bell chimed, Ayanna gathered her things and slung her badge over her chest. The hospital floor buzzed with life. Another case, another emergency, another set of lives in her care. But this time, when she walked through the hallway, no one looked past her. They looked to her. Respect hadn't been handed to her. She hadn't demanded it either. She had earned it, the only way that truly matters. Through action, through clarity, through grace under pressure, and in the silence between the noise, she had been heard, at last. The sky outside the hospital stretched wide and golden, a soft amber glow pouring through the high windows of the recovery wing. The chaos of the week had settled, replaced by the low, methodical hum of healing, a rhythm hospitals eventually find no matter what storms they weather. In one of the side courtyards, where the staff sometimes slipped away to catch their breath, Nurse Ayanna Bell sat alone on a weathered bench. The breeze lifted the edge of her scrub cap. In her lap rested a cup of tea, warm and untouched. She wasn't in a hurry to drink it. She wasn't in a hurry for anything. Around her, the world kept moving. Patients discharged, stretchers wheeled in, doctors deep in conversation as they passed. But here, in this corner of stillness, Ayanna let the quiet stretch. She remembered the operating room, the glare of the lights, the sudden shift from routine to crisis. She remembered the look on Dr. Whitman's face just before he fell, confusion, then pain, and something else, fear. And she remembered how quickly the silence had filled the room after his body hit the floor, but it hadn't paralyzed her, not even for a second, because she had known something was wrong. She had trusted her instinct, her training, her calm. It wasn't pride that kept her steady. It wasn't a need to prove anyone wrong. It was something deeper, a commitment to do no harm, to speak when it mattered, to act, especially when no one else would. Inside the hospital, the plaque outside operating room 2 gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. Listen, always, everyone matters. A resident paused to read it before scrubbing in. He wasn't there the day it all happened, but he'd heard the stories, whispers in hallways, quiet acknowledgments in the elevator, a new respect riding the edges of every mention of Nurse Ayanna Bell. In the lounge, Dr. Miriam Cho stood flipping through a chart when Dr. Whitman entered, slower than before, more careful with each step. He was dressed in civilian clothes, no white coat. He wasn't cleared for surgery yet. That would take time. But even stripped of his title, something about him looked different. The old pride hadn't returned. In its place was a quiet awareness. He approached Ayanna later that day, near the nurse's station. She was updating a patient's vitals, focused, exacting. When she noticed him, she looked up, neutral. They didn't exchange many words. They didn't have to. He handed her a small folded note, then turned and left. Alone again, Ayana unfolded the paper. Inside, his handwriting was rough, but clear. Was wrong. You saw what I refused to. Thank you for saving my life, and for not needing me to say more than this. A.W. She folded it once more and tucked it into her pocket without a word. She would never show it to anyone, not because it wasn't important, but because it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the change behind them. Narration fades in, soft and grounded, over scenes of the hospital shifting into another evening. True strength doesn't always wear a white coat. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner, steady, unshaken, waiting to be heard. And sometimes it saves lives, even the ones who never listened. In a final frame, Ayana walks down the corridor, her back straight, her stride unhurried. Young nurse watches her pass and instinctively stands taller. A senior surgeon offers a respectful nod. She doesn't respond with grandeur. No flourish. No acknowledgement of the shift she's caused, because Ayana Bell didn't come to be a hero. She came to work, to care, to speak when others wouldn't. And in doing so, she rewrote something far more lasting than just a single moment. In a surgical theater, she rewrote the silence and turned it into strength.